Good evening. Welcome back to Historical Light, an independent Masonic show focused on the historical events and aspects within Freemasonry. As always, I'm your host, Brother Alex Powers, past master at Gardner Lodge. I want to welcome you guys back. We also have with us our co-host, Brother Robert Marshall. Brother Robert, if you go ahead and introduce yourself.
Greetings, folks. Glad to be back here on Historical Light once again. And now that I'm a permanent fixture, I guess I'll always be here. Past master of Waco Lodge and a crazed historian. So very excited for tonight's topic.
Thank you for joining us again, brother. And our special guest this evening is none other than Brother Angel Millar. Brother Millar, if you go ahead and introduce yourself.
Sure. Well, thanks very much for inviting me on. It's a pleasure to be here. Do you want me to say more?
Oh, sure. What's your Masonic background?
Oh, sorry. Oh, yeah. So I became a member of the craft in 2001. And I'm mostly known for writing books on Freemasonry. So,
good stuff.
Yeah.
Well, brother, we really appreciate you coming on the show this evening. Lucky that I've been able to be a friend with you for several years now. We met up for the first time up at Masonicon in Attleboro there.
Yeah, that's right. We did. That's right.
Yeah, we had some very lively conversations and kept up with your work since then. You do some amazing stuff, so we really appreciate you having you on the show. What's been going on with you lately? How's the craft and life?
Good, busy. I was in Los Angeles about 2 weeks ago, speaking at the Masonic Con there, which was a great event. It was incredibly busy, but they did an amazing job. South Pasadena Lodge. It was an incredibly busy time, but just packed with speakers and movies and different things going on. It was a tour de force of Freemasonry.
That's awesome. Yeah, I was keeping up with that over social media. It looked like quite the event.
It did, yeah. Yeah, and it was good to connect with many of the brothers that you would know, Arturo de Hoyos, Timothy Hogan, and many other brothers from around the U.S. were there, which was it was great to see them.
That's awesome. So we've got quite a few of these Masonic conventions popping up all around. Brother Robert, you guys got one down in Texas your way too. Mm-hmm. What do you guys think of these? Are they a benefit to the craft?
Personally, I think that it's been an enormous benefit to the craft, and I think largely because it's members. Taking the initiative and putting on events, the kind of events that they want to see and want to participate in, and not waiting for the Grand Lodge to do it for them and then complaining that it's not what they wanted. So I think it's been an enormous benefit, and I think it's probably bringing in or helping to bring in, guys that are more focused on the historical and the esoteric as well. So I think that's a plus.
Agreed. Brother Robert, what's been your experience with Masonic cons or conventions of sorts?
I'm very much in agreement with Angel. To piggyback on the last thing he said there, I actually think they're kind of an answer to a unfortunate trend of Grand Lodge communications getting away from having done these kinds of things in the past. If you look back into the history of the fraternity, the Grand Lodge sessions often included the kinds of things that are happening at these Masonic cons now. So I'm glad to see them coming back. And hopefully, who knows, in the very, very early days of Masonry, back in the operative days, skipping out on a convention was included the penalty of death if you didn't have a good reason. So you never know how serious these guys will take these things.
Good point. Good point.
No, really, I really enjoy them. They're really great. This last one down here, there was a variety of topics. So there were some very, very, very esoteric things, Kabbalah and stuff like that. Very much was the theme of one brother's presentation. Then you had Brent Morris present on statistic trends in American Freemasonry over the last 100 years, what we can get from them and where we're going with them, what we need to do about them, all that kind of stuff. A look at the numbers, which is something that is kind of popular in Masonry, but also kind of really unpopular. So it was an interesting presentation. And some just general, or not general, some pure history topics. So there was history of the early ritual in Texas, how it kind of developed and got formalized. Original for the first 20 years or so, Texas Masonic ritual was completely based on Jeremy Cross's hieroglyphic chart. So how we emerged from that and established our own kind of flavor of Masonry, as well as Joseph Wages did a topic on the actual Illuminati from Bavaria, who they were, what they did. And of course, he worked on that documentary that just came out last week with Johnny Royal as the main guy.
Just released. I have not seen that yet, but it looks like quite the show. I really enjoyed the first one, the 33 and Beyond. So looking forward to getting a chance to sit down and watch that. Have either of you guys been able to see that film yet?
Yeah, they actually played it in the as part of the Los Angeles Masonic Con, and it's actually on Amazon Prime as well. So it's well worth watching. It's really good.
Very nice.
Yeah.
We'll have to check that out. Well, Brother Millar, again, we appreciate having you on. This evening, we got you on to talk about a pretty cool topic, actually an upcoming book you have that is the 3 stages of initiatic spirituality: craftsman, warrior, and magician. So, Brother Millar, if you don't mind, we'll kick it over to you and let you lead off this discussion.
Sure. So you might want to ask me some questions just to get things going. But yeah, so my next book, which will be out in February 2020, so a little less than 6 months, looks at the initiatic process through the craftsman, warrior, and magician. And so the craftsman section is focused largely on alchemy, Kabbalah, and Freemasonry. The warrior section looks largely at the martial arts, as well as the warrior in mythologies, in Buddhism and so on. And then the magician covers a pretty wide spectrum from sort of the ancient sort of types of magic all the way through to, let's say, more sexual type magic like Tantra, and then all the way up to the modern positive thinking movement and quote-unquote chaos magic, which would probably be one of the latest developments, although that's about 40 years old right now, so maybe a little more than that. Yeah.
So now I would start off, if you don't mind, because when we get into such topics, we get a lot of guys that don't really, flow that way. I'm very much an esoteric minded person, so I'm right there with you. But for the people that, think lodge is just lodge and take it at face value, where do we see the stuff coming into the craft versus, making it what we want it to be? Where do we see the magic aspects come into the craft of Masonry?
In terms of historically or... Well, I mean, I think really that influence comes in mostly during the 18th century when Freemasonry spreads to France and Germany in particular, because there you start to get the higher degrees being created. And a lot of them are based on, or at least influenced by, Rosicrucianism, Hermeticism, alchemy, Christian mysticism, and so on. And so probably the best known example would be the Rose Choir degree, which is in the Scottish Rite today, but pretty much every single rite within Freemasonry, there have been many of them throughout the ages, has had some form of Rose Choir degree. The rites of Memphis and Mithraeum have a Rose Choir degree, for example, although they're considered irregular or clandestine. But the Rose Choir degree is partly influenced by Catholicism and partly influenced by Rosicrucianism, and hence you have the cross with the rose in the center, which is a pretty standard Rosicrucian symbol. And Rosicrucianism is a kind of Christian mysticism that draws on sort of ancient Greek mythology or Neoplatonism, and on alchemy and Hermeticism. So it would be mostly during the 18th century that you get this kind of coming into Freemasonry. I would say probably the distinction between Freemasonry and an occult order today that might be influenced by these same things. It might be influenced by Freemasonry as well, such as the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn or the Ordo Templi Orientis, is that typically in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn or these other orders that are still around, you would be given some kind of occult teachings. It might be the tarot, or how to summon spirits, or how to contact some kind of God form, or working with some kind of inner energy. And we really don't find that in Freemasonry at all. There's a big distinction between those different types of orders, I think.
Angel, I've gotten to talk with you about this a little bit before, and I know, I guess my greatest exposure to this kind of stuff is The Masonic Magician by Bob Cooper, Cagliostro, The Egyptian Rite of the 1700s. I know Cagliostro very strongly argued that it wasn't so much that this stuff was coming in to Freemasonry in the 1700s, but that it was coming back. However, of course, he had potentially had a personal reason to say that. He's the guy sharing it with people, so he may have wanted to convince people that it was coming back instead of coming new. Has your research suggested one or the other? You're saying here it was introduced in the 1700s. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think it was introduced during that time. I mean, there are a couple of tiny little references before that during the 17th century, if memory serves me correctly, but these are sort of often kind of comedic little references, like the Freemasons and the Rosicrucians going to dinner together and eating a phoenix and this kind of thing, in some local paper somewhere. But serious references tend to come in during the 18th century or after. But that's not to say that Freemasonry doesn't have its own sort of mystery, or even its own kind of mysticism, or what some people might call gnosis, or esoteric or mystical knowledge. If you look at the old charges, these are incredibly strange mythologies. They go back all the way to around 1400 AD, talking about how geometry came to England from Egypt and ancient Greece, and it's influenced partly by the myth of Pythagoras and other curious. There are other curious things in there, maybe Stoicism as well, and this idea that the world will be destroyed by fire or by flood and this kind of thing, and and Freemasonry develops this ritual of 3 degrees out of 2 degrees earlier on, which were in a much more primitive form, it has to be said, but they're in embryo more or less. But it creates something that's absolutely unique, I think. And it's interesting that alchemy or Hermeticism, or later on Egyptology or something like this, is an influence on Freemasonry on the higher degrees. But to me, I think that in a way that the craft degrees are quite possibly more interesting, especially when you take into account what was going on before that, such as the old charges. It's really this really strange and enigmatic thing that I don't think you can find elsewhere very easily. But it's 600 years or now 600 years of this development, which is a very slow development, but it creates something truly, I think, unique.
Mm-hmm.
So this book, looking at it here, it covers, looks like, the initiatic experience, the exposure to this. How important would you say these aspects that we're talking about, these esoteric aspects, are to the initiatic experience itself?
Right. Well, initiation really is the esoteric. Initiation literally means to begin. So you could see it in a more profane way, that you're beginning something. But in terms of a kind of Masonic initiation. It is fundamentally the sort of penetrating of the esoteric, of an esoteric understanding. And, esoteric means the inner, and typically in society, of course, let's say if we went back 100 or 200 or 300 years, you would have the exoteric or the outer, which would be the religion, which in this case would almost always be, would have been Christianity. And if going back 3 centuries, maybe a few deists and a few Jews, but other religions come in later on. If you want to be historically accurate, really, at that time in England and in London, the people that were joining were Christians. And Christianity, and of course society as well, has its exoteric understanding of morals and how we should behave, and what the religion means. And then the esoteric is the inner understanding. And you can't really have one without the other. So there is a danger in overemphasizing the esoteric. But in terms of initiation, yes, I mean the whole point is to penetrate into an esoteric or inner understanding.
Wonderful.
So I know we're not supposed to judge a book by its cover, but when I was getting a degree in literature, I was specifically told by a professor, always judge a book by its cover. You can learn something by looking at the book's cover. So we're looking at yours, and as somebody who spent a lot of time working on a Leonardo da Vinci anatomical book, I'm fascinated by the appearance of what could be seen as a Vitruvian man.
Yeah, that's right.
Why would you choose that to represent the initiatic spirituality?
Yeah, well, actually, I didn't. It was designed by the publisher, but I quite like it. So
That's impressive.
It's not what I wouldn't have thought that up, but I'm glad the artist did think it up, because I think it's kind of an intriguing image. And for those who haven't seen it, it's this man with outstretched arms and legs, and this kind of energy is pouring into him, it seems. And then around him are the various circles, and in 3 of the circles are the alchemical elements for sulfur, salt, and mercury, which again you could liken these to the craftsman, the warrior, and the magician as well.
Sure.
And very briefly, and of course this won't be entirely accurate because there are other ways you can see it, but the salt is the preserving nature as well, preserves and fixes, and sulfur is essentially what corrodes or burns away or destroys. And then the mercury is sort of fluid, and it's often associated with some consciousness as well. So, but you could look at those in as the craftsman being perhaps salt, and the magician being mercury. That's a pretty typical association, and the warrior being sulfur as well. So it's this kind of structure runs throughout the book.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, Brother Angel, let me ask you this. We get a lot of people watching the show and in the group and everything that are in different stages of Masonry. You get a lot of people that aren't even in Masonry yet, but are just interested. Who would you say this book is best targeted to? Is this something that a non-initiated person would gain something from, or would it be most appropriate to kind of have the insight before delving into something of this nature?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, so Freemasonry actually factors in quite a small amount in the book. It's probably a few percentage, although it's mentioned mostly in the first section on the craftsman for obvious reasons. But and it's mentioned occasionally later on. But it's a very small part of the book. Although from another perspective, you could see that the whole book is related to Freemasonry as well. So the craftsman section could relate to the Blue Lodge degrees. The warrior section would relate to the, say, Templar degrees, and the magician maybe to some aspects of the Scottish Rite, but also to the Societas Rosicruciana and so on. and then to these other orders that have been influenced by Freemasonry, although are not Masonic per se, such as the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. But the book is also kind of structured as a kind of literary initiatic experience as well. So each section has the same number of chapters, and they follow in a particular order. So one section will deal with the history and symbolism of, say, the craftsman or the warrior or the magician. And then later sections will look at the ritual, and then a final section looks at more practical aspects that are related to each of these. So meditations practiced by the warrior or by the magician, and so on.
Very, very cool. So you said this is expected to come out 2020, correct?
Yeah, February 2020.
Awesome. So let's see here. Once this book comes out, who do you initially address this to, and how do you get it out there? Do you do a lot of lodge talks about this, or what is your primary market with it?
Well, in regards to who it's probably going to appeal to, I would say clearly Freemasons, but I think mostly men, given the warrior aspect. I'm sure there are some women that would be interested in that, but I think overwhelmingly that's going to mean it has a male audience. Many of them will not be Freemasons, but I think probably typically it's going to be men who are interested in some kind of self-development, maybe with an interest in the esoteric or the occult, but maybe with an interest in, let's say, mythology and self-improvement in other ways, such as weightlifting or martial arts. So I would say that would be the primary audience. In regards to getting out there, I probably we'll be doing some lodge talks, and I'm sure I'll be speaking different Masonic events around the country next year. And I have my own YouTube channel as well now, The Spiritual Survival, and now I'll probably be doing quite a few interviews on the subject as well. So yeah.
Very, very cool. So yeah, you do have this new YouTube channel going, and you cover mainly this topic, correct? The esoterics and spirituality?
Yeah, I've looked a little bit at different ways of self-improvement in general, but yeah, Freemasonry has come up a few times, and I'll be giving some more talks on Freemasonry and esoteric aspects of Freemasonry, and just maybe a little lesser known aspects of the world of the esoteric in general as well.
That's awesome. So how is that show going? How are you enjoying it so far?
So far, the response has been pretty good, and I'm enjoying it. I get to talk about things that I might not necessarily want to write about in an article, and I can speak a little bit more freely. Right. So that's all good. Yeah.
Yeah, it's always nice to be able to kind of, like we're doing here, to sit down and hash it out, be able to have that direct conversation. So that's awesome doing that, man, because you really have some phenomenal stuff that you talk about on a regular basis. So
great, thank you.
Yeah, it's awesome to be able to sit down and have that chat with you. Now, one thing I was looking at within the confines of your new book, you mentioned the connection between the Sufi Muslims again. You talk about that quite often in a lot of your material, I notice. How did you come by the connection between the Muslim world and the initiatic experience?
Yeah, so my previous book, The Crescent and the Compass, was a historical examination of connections between Freemasonry and Islam, or more correctly, between certain sort of radical Freemasons who are interested in the esoteric and spirituality, sometimes in quite extreme forms, and between Muslim thinkers that again were let's say at the cutting edge of Islamic politics, mostly from around 1850 to around 1920 or so. But it wasn't something that I necessarily planned to write about, at least to such a degree. But when I started looking into it, I found more and more connections that I'd never heard of, and It surprised me, but didn't shock me. I sort of suspected some of the individuals I write about had such a connection. Henry William Quilliam in England, he was an early convert to Islam in England. He was a white British guy who converted to Islam and became very important in promoting a friendlier face of Islam to the British public, and in advocating for the rights of British Muslims, or Muslims under the British Empire, I should say. And to all intents and purposes, he looks like a sort of strict Muslim. He was funded partly by the Ottoman Empire. This is around the 1890s, so a little bit before and after. But when you actually dig more into his life, you discover that he was a very active Freemason, and he was also in the Swedenborgian rite of Freemasonry. And then he founded his own order called the Ancient Order of Zuzinites, which was very much based on Freemasonry, but sort of drew in this Egyptian mythology, which was then sort of secularized, presumably because it would be the sin of polytheism, or the sin of shirk, according to Islam, if he were bringing in these actual deities. So he actually turns it into a kind of secular mythology. But you find these curious connections between Islam and Freemasonry all over the place from around 1850 into the early 20th century. So in America as well, you have groups like the Nation of Gods and Earth, or the 5%er movement, and they have a catechism where they refer to Freemasons as Muslims' sons. And you find this weird connection between Freemasonry and Islam as well in the Middle East. Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani, who was possibly the most influential political Muslim of the last 100 or so years. He joined Freemasonry in Egypt, I think around the 1850s or 1860s, and was very active in Freemasonry in Egypt. But he is known today as really the grandfather of Islamism. He was the person who came up with the idea of a pan-Islamic ideology that you would unite the Muslims around the Middle East to push out the Western forces that were occupying much of the Middle Eastern land at that point. And, so you have these intriguing connections really across the globe for quite a significant amount of time. And it's kind of curious that we are where we are today. And yet, for all the books that have been written on Islam, and maybe even for all the books that have been written on Freemasonry, virtually nothing has been written on this subject.
Right. Now, it's interesting. So you touch quite often on the connection there. But I believe today it's kind of frowned upon in the Middle East, is it not?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, and a really unfortunate chapter in this history is that Freemasonry is often used or spoken about in the most extreme forms of Islamism and jihadism. It's been mentioned in Al-Qaeda's material and so on.
Really?
And the thing to realize is that 99% of the time they actually don't know what Freemasonry is. They use the term Freemasonry in a very specific technical sense, and it's the same in the same way that you hear the phrase Zionist entity to mean Israel. So if you look at jihadist material, if they're talking about Freemasonry, 99% of the time they're not talking about the fraternity. They're talking about the influence of America, and to a lesser extent the influence of other Western nation states on the Middle East and on Islam or on Muslims today. Right. And we're all aware of the use of the term Crusader So obviously, if a jihadist or someone else is talking about the Crusaders, they're talking about, say, American military power today, or maybe Canadian or British military power in the Middle East, because they're the invaders with the weapons, so they're the Crusaders. But when they talk about Freemasonry, typically they're talking about a cultural influence on the Middle East. So it can be anything from alcohol to democracy or voting to women's rights to Pokemon Go. I mean, it spans a really wide spectrum. But they're really talking about a cultural influence that's unwelcome, that they see as being imposed on the Middle East and on Muslims. So that's what 99% of the time when they talk about Freemasonry, quote unquote, that's actually what they're talking about in this world of jihadism.
Interesting.
There's a subtle difference I've seen in the colloquial use of the word Freemasonry. I think that's what you're getting at here, Angel. In that when they use the word Freemasonry, they may not necessarily be talking about the fraternity, but that kind of influence from the West that's being rejected. And so there I've seen them use the word in the way you're saying. I think the most important word in defining it for them would be pervasive. So what we're talking about is a word, Freemasonry, being used to represent the symbol of a pervasive influence from the West. And interestingly, here in the West, we do have a colloquial use of the word Freemasonry that I think is similar, and there was probably some kind of connection early on, and they went their different paths in the East and West. In the West, Freemasonry has been used in colloquial language. I don't think many Freemasons use it this way because we see it differently, but lay people, if you will, the profane, will refer to Freemasonry when talking about a just kind of a shared sentiment among people. So they might call it the Freemasonry of, the Freemasonry of actors in Hollywood. And they're referring to a kind of shared experience among those people. It doesn't have the negative connotation it does in the Middle East, which is really important, but interesting the way both of them kind of work their way into language.
Yeah.
Indeed. So I noticed another part that you touch on within the book is Crowley to a degree. So without going too far into revealing the book, what is your take on Crowley? So many people have so many different interpretations of his work and his life. How does he fit in here, and what's your overall thought process on him?
Yeah, well, my overall assessment of Crowley is that he's a complicated figure, and and you partly have to see him in his time. And he did many things that were unwise to get himself some publicity in many cases. We now in the West have a kind of cliched image of Crowley. And he's typically associated with, the dark and the satanic. And even those devotees of Crowley who would, deny anything satanic about him, nevertheless, many of them, would dress in all black and would associate themselves with a rather dark imagery and dark things. Crowley himself, I think, was a much more complicated person, and in many regards was kind of a brilliant individual. And when he was at college, he practiced boxing. Then he was practicing mountaineering. And that alone would be interesting, but then he became a member of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn and started practicing magic. Later on in Mexico City, he was initiated into irregular Freemasonry, and was clearly influenced by Freemasonry, although he wasn't in a lodge that we would recognize as regular. Nevertheless, he was to quite a large degree influenced by his experiences of Freemasonry. But, beyond that, he was, of course, an author, mostly of books on magic or the occult. But, he wrote some fiction as well. He wrote poetry. And beyond that, he also was at least for a time was a fine art painter or an artist, mostly in Germany, and had this very wide range of interests and practices, and was somebody who traveled all over the world, literally everywhere from the middle of Canada to the Himalayas, and when really virtually no one else was doing that at all. Had a significant, very serious interest in religion, and did some quite curious things in that regard. One of them being he wrote his own pseudo Sufi text, "The Scented Garden of Abdullah," and he's also claimed to have had this sort of sacred text revealed to him as well. Whether you believe that or not, and again, coming back to his art, whether you think that it's great art or poor quality art, I don't think it really matters, actually. I think what's important about Crowley is that he was somebody who was, always prepared to try something new and to throw himself into it, whether it was writing, mountaineering, boxing, painting, or traveling the world. And he was a highly controversial figure and still is, but nevertheless, there aren't many people that could take on all of that. And,
that understanding of Crowley as a guy who's always ready for more calls to mind a quote from one of his followers post his life, but one of the more well-known and well-read Crowley enthusiasts, Robert Anton Wilson, once said that the true initiation never ends. Do you think that would be in line not only with what you're saying about Crowley, but also your book, The 3 Stages of Initiatic Spirituality? Do you kind of get at this idea that we're always pursuing initiation?
Yeah, well, I think that's right. The true initiation does never end. And I'm sure you've had this experience where you'll read a book, say, at one point in your life, and it won't really mean much to you. And 20 years later, you go back to it, and it's just a total revelation. And you can't believe that you didn't see anything in it before, And if you read it again 20 years hence, you'll find even more in it as well. So and that is the esoteric, right? That's literally what it is. That you read a book, you think it means one thing, and then you have life experience, and after 10, 20, 30, 40 years, you can read it on so much more of a more subtle level and a more penetrating level. And that really is the esoteric. It's penetrating into those depths, and that definitely never ends. Yeah.
Well, then I would think that in that sense and within that context, your book is really making perhaps the most important argument Freemasonry could have made right now. In that, in looking at the history of Freemasonry, I don't know that the initiation experience in Freemasonry had ever become so little valued as it has over different parts of the last 100 years, and even fairly recently, where it's become so common for a guy to get initiated and then just enter into fellowship and never leave that fellowship, like that it just becomes a fraternity in the social sense, and there's no further development of the study of the arts and sciences, for example, or just that initiatic process. What you're saying here is we need to extend our initiation.
Yeah, well, we definitely need to extend our understanding for sure. And I think, there is this weird thing in Freemasonry where, in my experience, the vast majority of Freemasons have a real interest in Freemasonry and in symbolism and mythology and so on. And but they're all kind of a little bit shy about mentioning it, which is weird. But I think my guess is that it goes back to the various wars of the 20th century, where after World War II, or maybe World War One, or after Korea or Vietnam, you had this influx of guys who were more interested in the fraternal aspects, socializing with other guys. And then, the men that really were interested in the symbolism and ritual and mythology that stuck around for decades, when the other guys probably left, they became a little too nervous to speak up about it, because all the other guys that had joined just wanted to smoke cigars and have barbecues and drink cognac or whatever it was. I'm not knocking that, but yeah, I think that's probably what it was. But I sometimes give this tell this story about when I first joined Freemasonry, and I had this experience like most people and most guys in most lodges, and especially at that time. And every month there would be some talk. Most of them, one of them was on men's health, one was on tax law, one was by a fireman, and this kind of thing. And it was okay for a few months. I didn't mind it. It was kind of interesting. But there wasn't a single talk on Freemasonry, and I'd only been a master Mason for maybe 6 months when I gave my first talk. But I approached the master and said, I want to give a talk on Freemasonry, and I did. And I was very inexperienced, so I didn't want to talk about Freemasonry per se. So I spoke about certain historical aspects and spiritual aspects within British history from around the 12th century and until later on, that related to Freemasonry. And then I could make comparisons without making any kind of historical claims, but just pointing out these sort of interesting connections and philosophical connections. And but before I gave the talk, my friend in the lodge, the guy had become really my best friend at the time, who later dropped out. Is a very intellectual guy, but he said to me, look, we haven't had a talk on Freemasonry in years. Everybody's going to love it. He said, but there's one guy, you know who he is. And he comes and he makes stupid comments and he makes stupid jokes and he makes wisecracks every month. He said, look, he's probably going to fall asleep. He's going to hate it. He's going to be bored, but everybody else is going to appreciate it. So just ignore him, because, everybody else will be there for you.
That guy's a member of your lodge too then, huh?
Yeah, well, so anyway,
did he surprise you?
Well, so this guy was probably in his 60s at the time. He was an old guy, making the wisecracks, whatever. So anyway, this guy I'd been warned about, he came up to me after the talk, and to paraphrase, he said, that was great, and we need more of that. And the question is, not really why has he been there for 40 years, but why has no one thought to themselves, this guy's been coming for 40 years. There must be something that interests him. Yeah. Is there a way we can engage that so he's not acting like a stupid kid? Because it's clearly because of boredom. He's not getting what he thinks he should be getting. Sure. And other people came up to me after and said, oh yeah, I'm really into like mythology, and like it was some big secret. Everybody has this big secret. They all are interested in the same things, but they don't want to say. I mean, this was nearly 20 years ago, but I think it's a problem in writing lodges often thinking that they don't have any interest in this stuff, because typically, at very least, they have an interest in mythology or self-improvement or something along those lines. I mean, I would say that there's a danger in talking about the esoteric, because a lot of the ways that people talk about it is to get very technical about some aspect of, let's say, the Kabbalah, and then what Hebrew letter should go on what sphere, and this which path joins. And to be honest, that's of interest to maybe 5% of the brothers, and everybody else is just thinking, I don't know what this means, and I don't know how this relates to my life. And I think if you are going to talk about the esoteric, you really want to try and relate it to people's lives. And this is why it's important to you, and not to go off into these flights of fantasy and trying to show how clever you are. You want to be talking with your brothers, not at them. So, I think that's been a problem as well, that that when they have got to talk about the esoteric, it can be so complicated. And often there's some kind of agenda that the speaker wants to show how smart they are, or they have some secret historical family connection because they're from Scotland, their family, and there's some connection to Scotland or whatever, wherever it is. I've heard of all kinds of theories. But usually, often, or from what I have seen in the past, maybe not so much now, there's been some kind of agenda with it. So this is also, that's also going to make people not want to hear about those things. But I think, in the last few years, especially with the Masonic cons, that now there's the way of talking about it is much more engaging. We're talking together. It's not the speaker talking at you. We're together discussing this field of interest, and it's of relevance to your life because, and I think that's a better approach.
Mm-hmm. I'd be inclined to agree with you. I know when I give a talk and somebody refers to it as a lecture, whether it's beforehand or they're remembering, I'll always stop and like, I didn't lecture. We had a discussion about a topic, and I just happened to be the person that was leading it.
Yeah.
And on the flip side, recently I was at an event, and this brilliant brother, and if he watches this, he's going to know who I'm talking about. And so I want to preface it by saying, I love you, man. I love the research you do and the knowledge you share. But he got a little carried away one night in a group of maybe 20, 25 of us. And right in line with what you're saying, he started telling guys that if they weren't masters of the Hebrew language, that if they don't know Hebrew, then they're just wasting their time with Freemasonry, because you need to know every letter of Hebrew, and you need to know what each one means and what it means when they're together, or else you're just operating without the knowledge you need. And he just went a little too far, got a little too carried away. But it's easy to fall into those traps.
Yeah, apparently it is. Yeah. But getting back to lodge education, let me just say, in my lodge, and I think probably other lodges are beginning this, when an entered apprentice goes through the ritual or fellow craft, or especially with the newly made master mason, they are asked to give some kind of talk on some aspect of Freemasonry. And for the first two rituals, it can be very short, just 5 minutes about, well, what was one thing that interested you, and then the master mason talk is longer. And I think that's actually what you need, because you need to get guys into the habit of talking and expressing themselves in front of their brothers, so that they're not afraid to say, actually, this is what interests me, and I'm going to give a talk about it and make it interesting to you. Because otherwise you do get this weird sort of pressure where everyone wants to conform to the lowest common denominator. But I think that's definitely changing, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, totally. So, random thought crossing my mind as we're going through all this. Now, we had mentioned Crowley just a little bit ago, and while we were going through that, the number one thing went on in my head, through my research with Crowley. He was very interested within the confines of Freemasonry and stuff, but I'd say the difference we saw is Freemasonry and like practices really preaches the fact of balance. Whereas Crowley really decided to take one side and go as far as he could with it, to the extremes. Now, within that in mind, and the concept of balance, as we talk about the initiatic experience, especially here discussing the craftsman, the warrior, and the magician archetypes, for someone coming in through that initiatic experience, how important is it, in your terms, to consider the balance there within?
Yeah, well, balance is essential. And pushing through is also essential as well. You don't want to remain at this sort of beginner level. I think the problem that Crowley had was that, he had an extremely strict and fundamentalist Christian upbringing. The very few people, even in the Bible Belt, would have such a strict an authoritarian upbringing as Crowley experienced, and he completely rebelled against it. And then the question for someone who's practicing the esoteric, or he was practicing the occult, but let's just say the esoteric is that the esoteric, the inner, requires the exoteric or the outer. So that's the balance, right? So you have the idea of like moral behavior and a standard of behavior and of way of treating people. But then you also have these sort of more mystical experience or symbolism that takes you in a more mystical and metaphysical direction. But that's balanced by the morals, the acting in the world. And Crowley's problem, of course, was that he had rejected the sort of exoteric upbringing that he had and the Christian religion and just the way of behaving in British society at that time. So then you're left with this sort of very radical esoteric view where you're just going to push yourself into this more and more sort of mystical and even occult direction. And Crowley, I suppose you could say, tried to sort of rectify that by had this revelation, this sacred text revealed to him allegedly, and that's what he claimed. And so with this sacred text, you have some kind of semblance of behavior in the world. Now, whether that's in line with Christianity or opposed to it doesn't really matter, but there's some kind of notion of how you should behave in the world, and it's not just this ending up in some kind of metaphysical mental space. And I think that's a problem in the occult world and the esoteric world more broadly, that we've rejected the exoteric. We don't really know how to behave in the world at all. And so consequently, a lot of people who are involved in the esoteric or in the occult are very dysfunctional in the world, and they look very dysfunctional, and they can do things to actually harm themselves in the world. So they make themselves more ugly, or they would behave in some converse with people unless it's about the occult or something like that. And I think Freemasonry handles that well by the fact that Freemasonry does give you this way of behaving in the world. So you want to be supportive of your brothers, but you also want to be a good citizen, a good member of your society. You want to be supportive of your family. If you're going to be in a social event, you don't want to be drinking to intemperance or excess. You don't want to be getting drunk and acting crazy. So there are this exoteric understanding of, okay, this is how I behave in the world, because I want to become this kind of higher man, or what the Confucians call Chunzu, the superior man, or for women, the superior woman. But at the same time, there's also this metaphysical framework of thinking about God, of thinking about what's beyond death, and so on, and these symbols that seem to have some kind of mystical significance. So Freemasonry has a much better balance of the two than other societies might. And you could say even with traditional occult orders of the 18th or 19th century, or maybe even early 20th century, that there was some kind of understanding that you would have some kind of moral framework, and then you would move into this stuff. And but today, of course, that's not the case. You sort of rebel against society and you focus on the occult, and that's very unbalanced. It's not what you would find in any culture at all. So even in India or China, you might be practicing some sort of esoteric tradition, but you also adhere to the standards of society in most cases. Or in Sufism, let's say, that's probably a better example. If you're a Sufi Muslim, a traditional Sufi Muslim, let's say, then sure, you have these mystical experiences of meditating on Allah, but and some of the symbolism of Sufism, this use of alcohol as a metaphor in Sufi poetry, that would seem to be against the society, or at least the societal norms. But it's an esoteric understanding of the exoteric religion. So if you're a Sufi Muslim, a traditional Sufi Muslim, you also adhere to the religion of Islam, and you practice the Sharia, the Islamic law. So these things work together, right? you're not rejecting the exoteric, you're deepening your understanding of it. And because you have deepened your understanding of it, of course, from an outsider perspective, some people might say, whoa, that's going a bit too far. I don't really get that. But you yourself don't find any contradiction, if that
Well,
makes sense.
you struck on an interesting chord for me with that. So this idea that Freemasonry was bringing in these people who had some kind of basic foundation already. You called it a moral training, I think, but the shared experience that they already had when they showed up at the door. And I think that's demonstrably true across the centuries until maybe the last 100 years. And increasingly, we've become a much more secular society. And there's really not that exact same shared moral background. So now Freemasonry may be struggling to re-identify itself or figure out how do we bring these guys together now that they're not showing up at the door with the same background.
Well, again, I think that the Freemasonry is better able to handle this than some other, let's say, esoteric orders, in that it does give some kind of moral foundation, right? So no getting drunk, try to be a good citizen, be supportive of your family. If you have a religion, go to church or synagogue or temple, whatever it is. So Freemasonry does have both the exoteric and the esoteric, the inner and the outer. So I think that that's helpful. But yeah, that's one thing you should bear in mind if we're going to promote the esoteric is that also you need this foundation, and you shouldn't run away from the exoteric. That's, for many men in particular, that's going to be more important than the esoteric, because many men get no guidance growing up at all, either because their father is that the family, the mother and father are divorced, and the father lives somewhere totally different. They never see him, or maybe he's in jail, maybe he's some kind of addict, maybe he's at work all the time, or doing something else that makes him unavailable, or maybe he's just emotionally unavailable. I don't know about America so much, but I think the First and Second World Wars damaged the male psyche a great deal, and made the one generation just really, or one or two generations, really unable to connect with the later generations, because they had fathers that were totally shell-shocked by the war and unable to relate to anything, let alone a child. Although we want to emphasize the esoteric and the metaphysical, at the same time, we also want to emphasize the basic training that a man or would get in society, because that's what a lot of men really are missing today. So we want to be brothers and give just practical guidance as well. So
that's what many men really are missing today. There you go. I think through the historical lens you've just provided us, Freemasonry becomes more important to the advancement of society and for answering the questions young men have, maybe than it ever has been. Which is a good answer when guys ask, well, why don't young men care about Freemasonry anymore? The answer is, we just haven't done a good enough job of ourselves understanding that Freemasonry does provide what you're talking about. And then once we understand it, making sure that the rest of the world can understand that. They can't come looking for it if they don't know it's there.
Right, exactly, yeah. And I think Freemasonry has always provided some kind of solution for society's problems, not as a whole necessarily, but you think about the 18th century, when there was maybe an overemphasis on rational thought, and Freemasonry really exploded in popularity at that time, not by promoting the rational, but by promoting symbols and mystery and the mysterious and the spiritual and the supernatural, even in some rights. And then if you look later on with Prince Hall Masonry, Prince Hall Masonry was extremely influential in the after slavery in promoting the self-esteem of African American men, and really getting helping helping them to achieve in society. And then, after, World War One, II, Korea, and so on, when men maybe were sort of shell-shocked by these experiences, nevertheless, they could go to lodge and be around brothers who were supportive. So Freemasonry has always been able to respond to certain problems in society. And maybe that's caused problems within Freemasonry in the long run sometimes with, with an overemphasis on, on the fraternal aspects and not enough on the more esoteric aspects. Maybe other times it's been reversed. But today, certainly, we do need to be mindful of the fact that a great many men are just not receiving any guidance. And with that, whether they would admit it or could admit it even to themselves, have issues with low self-esteem and fear of how to behave in society and how to get on in the world. And yeah, that's certainly something the Freemasonry by its very nature addresses, because, once you join, we're all brothers together to be supportive, not necessarily financially supportive, but to give you the, the wisdom that we've acquired, or some kind of, emotional support or something like that. And just, and as an example of men behaving well, hopefully in every lodge, and when maybe the men they've grown up around have not behaved very well. So, yeah.
That's great. Well, brother, I want to kind of start wrapping things up here, but with this book coming out, what would be the main message that you would like to get across to those who read it? What's the main thing that you want to hit them?
Yeah, well, you mentioned balance earlier, so I would say, in that regard, anyway, maybe I would say something different at another time, but in regard to balance, certainly the book emphasizes, developing the mind, developing some kind of spirituality, but also developing the body as well, physically. So you want to develop all these aspects of yourself, and not just overemphasizing one aspect, which is always dangerous, actually.
Very well said. Totally agree with you. Well, let's move into closing arguments or closing statements, so to speak. Brother Robert, do you got anything for Brother Angel as we wrap this up?
I've been absolutely blown away. I've talked with you before, Angel. I'm always impressed, but you really, really spoke to a lot of my personal experience and a lot of the experiences I've heard other guys describe, especially guys my age. I'm 29 years old, so I'm one of those young guys in today's generation looking for something, and it turned out to be Freemasonry that I was talking about before. But I'll close out with a question, and if you could, in as few words as possible, just would you answer the question, what does initiatic spirituality offer to the young guy who picks up your book tomorrow? Why does he want to pursue initiatic spirituality?
To discover who he is.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you.
I like that. I like that a lot. Brother Angel, what would your closing statements be?
My closing statement? I haven't prepared one.
Oh, dude, what?
Remember, initiation never ends. He's not going to have a closing statement. It's forever now.
Yeah. So, I don't know. I have to think out something off the cuff, but I would just say, in regard to Freemasonry, let's definitely put forward the esoteric, and let's penetrate into the mysteries, but let's not forget the practical side. Let's be there for our brothers, guiding them in the more practical areas of life. Let's not getting drunk, being supportive of each other, being a decent person in society as well. Let's have that balance, and then I think we'll do well.
Well, I would entirely agree with you, and I gotta kind of write it there along with Robert. You totally touched on a lot of those aspects for me tonight as well. Being able to find that stuff in Freemasonry has really just made the difference in my world. So kind of everything you touched on there really hit home. The balance aspect, I think, is huge, but also to actually go for it at the same time. I see so much in Masonry today that's just kind of floating by, so to speak. A lot of guys don't push that esoteric, that deeper level, and it's more just a membership thing. So find that balance, but at the same time, as you mentioned earlier, Angel, push through, because if you don't go for those aspects, you're really missing what Masonry or any of these orders have to offer on their deepest level. So don't take it for granted. There's definitely something there, and it's worthwhile seeking it out. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely. And let me just say one last thing in regard to what you just said. If a brother does have an interest in, let's say, the esoteric or spirituality or self-improvement, I would say don't wait for somebody else to give the talk to you. Why don't you write a short talk and give that in large, and I'm sure it would be appreciated, and you'll get as much out of it as everybody else, if not more. So, let's take the initiative, and let's make the lodges what we want them to be instead of complaining that they're not what we want to be.
For sure. And, I'll put you on the spot here, Brother Angel, because I do got a lot of admiration for you, man. When we first met that evening, I don't know if you remember the crazy ride.
Yeah.
We got lost there and everything, but we got in these conversations and kind of brought up some stuff about life. And so, I think at one point you started talking about some things I'd like to improve. And immediately you offered up mentorship there, and not just to the point of a slick conversation, but you hopped on the phone with me within a week or two.
Right, that's right. Yeah.
So I just want to give you mad props there because I really appreciated that. That was taking not just Masonry or friendship as we know it, but taking it to that next level, which not a lot of people do anymore. So when we talk about this stuff, people, just take it to the respect that Brother Angel is one of those guys that knows what he's talking about, not just knows it, but also acts it out. So I think there's a lot to be said there. And just that I really appreciate your friendship and your mentorship in those ways, brother.
Likewise.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Insanely appreciate having you on the show this evening. It's always a pleasure to hear what you have to say. You're just an inspirational guy all around. You got some great material to put forth, and just so thankful that you are taking the time to present that to the craft as a whole. Before we close off tonight, though, I want to give a chance for you to put some plugs in of where people can get a hold of you and your materials and the show you got going on. Because like I said, you have some amazing stuff out there. We want everybody to have the opportunity to get proper exposure to it. So how can people get a hold of you and find your materials best?
Sure. So my website is angelmillar.com, ANGELMILLAR.com. And the YouTube channel is just called The Spiritual Survival, and there's also a website, thespiritualsurvival.com as well. And the book, The 3 Stages of Initiatic Spirituality, will be out in early February 2020.
Wonderful. And what is going to be the best platform to find that book? How are we going to find it when it comes out?
It's going to be on Amazon, and it'll be on all of the main websites like that. And or you can buy it through Inner Traditions already, I think, pre-order. So
sounds good. Well, we will definitely have those links listed below. So make sure you check those out. Visit Angel. And if you got any other questions, definitely hit him up. He's a great guy to talk to. But keep an eye out for that book. Again, that is The 3 Stages of Initiatic Spirituality, Craftsman, Warrior, Magician. It's going to be great. I'm definitely intrigued. Robert, are you intrigued?
Very, very intrigued.
All right. Well, I think it's going to be awesome. Cannot wait for it to come out. Brother Angel, thank you again so much for being on this evening. And with that, brethren, we will see you next time. Please check out the Facebook group, the Historical Light Masonic Research Group on Facebook, to continue the conversation there. And with that, we'll see you all next time. Keep preserving the light.